Okay, so today you're going to watch one of the most famous and influential Greek tragedies of all time, the Agamemnon, a drama composed by Aeschylus, the so-called father of tragedy. So let's begin again with the plot. You've heard it a couple of times. The Agamemnon is the first play in a trilogy of plays that were performed together in 458 BCE. They're known collectively as the Oresteia, and they include the Agamemnon, which will be performed today, and also the libation bearers and the Eumenides, which will be performed as a double bill next year. The plays are set in the aftermath of the Trojan War, the 10-year-long war waged by the Greeks upon the city of Troy over Helen, wife of Menelaus, a Greek. Helen was taken to Troy by the Trojan prince Paris, and as a result, the Greeks sailed to Troy to punish the Trojans and take Helen back. The Greek expedition was led by Agamemnon, who sacrificed his own daughter, Iphigenia, because he needed favorable winds to take the Greek fleets to Troy. And since then, his wife, Clytemnestra, filled with grief, rage, and bitterness, has spent 10 years waiting for her husband to return. The Agamemnon is the story of that homecoming, the story of how a mother avenges her daughter by killing her husband. In the second play, Clytemnestra's son Orestes will avenge his father by killing his mother and her lover, Aegisthus. In the third play, Orestes will be pursued by the Erinyes, the goddesses also known as the Furies. My talk today is about the Furies. Seeking protection from the god Apollo, he'll travel to Athens, where he'll be put on trial. And in that trial, he'll be acquitted of the murder of his mother. And the Furies will be welcomed into Athens as kind goddesses, now to be known instead as the Eumenides. So the Agamemnon, the first play in the trilogy, is a tale of bloodshed, grief, rage, and revenge. And it's also a tale of homecoming. And not just the homecomings of Agamemnon and Orestes, but crucially, the homecoming of the Furies. These goddesses are, as Emanuela's research unfolds, a constant presence in the Agamemnon and in the plays that follow. Now we, as the audience, see the Furies for the first time with our own eyes in the third play of the trilogy, the Eumenides, when they tear into the performance arena as the chorus, a moment that must have been astonishing, terrifying even for Aeschylus' first audience at the Theatre of Dionysus in Athens. So to give you a flavour of the impact that they may have had, this is how some modern productions chose to represent these entities. Of course, we don't know how they were represented in Aeschylus' play, but one ancient anecdote in the life of Aeschylus tells us that when Aeschylus' chorus of Furies first entered the theatre in 458 BCE, their appearance was so shocking to the audience that children fainted and women in the audience actually miscarried. Now, we must take this anecdote with a fairly large grain of salt, not least because the question of whether there would have even been children and women in Aeschylus' audience is still a matter of controversy. Nevertheless, the moment when the audience actually see the Furies in the third play must have had tremendous impact, and it still shocks today, as you can see from these images, and come back next year to see how the Warwick students choose to deliver this dramatic moment. But one reason why the moment that the Furies actually appear on stage carries such an impact is because the presence of the Furies has been a central theme of the trilogy right from the beginning. Until this moment, the Furies have appeared selectively to significant characters in the trilogy, to the Trojan prophetess, Cassandra, in the Agamemnon, who we must remember sees differently to those around her, to Orestes in the libation bearers, who's presented to us as insane, and in the Eumenides to the terrified priestess of the temple of Apollo, at which Orestes has claimed sanctuary, who describes to the audience the Furies before they, as the chorus, come out of the stage building and into the visible performance arena. And not only are we encouraged at moments in the trilogy to visualize the presence of the Furies through the eyes of characters on the stage who are variously possessed, maddened, and terrified, but tension surrounding the menacing presence of the Furies has been building since the first scene of the first play, the Agamemnon. As Emanuela shows us in her publication, Seeing the Invisible, and elaborates more fully in Performing the Cosmos, which is forthcoming. The Furies have been there from the beginning, half seen, murkily, ominously conjured by the imagery of the script, working in tandem with the staging. So in imagery, as you can see here, of fire, the beacons that open the Agamemnon, the very name Helen, or Helene, as a home-wrecking firebrand that races to Troy and back, the agonizing fire that Cassandra feels coursing through her body when she's possessed by the god Apollo. Also, in deep, vibrant colors of purple, red, orange, and yellow, raw hues of the dyes squeezed from saffron flowers and purple fish, conjuring ideas of dripping blood, wasted life force, of bitterness and rage. In imagery of earth, dust, and ashes, of what is dark, earthy, and powerful. And in imagery of wind, air, breath, and song. So all this imagery, the fire, the colours of life that is quenched, the earthy darkness, and the breath of wind and song, is all there in Aeschylus's script, and it awakens in performance. So just some details that you should look out for today when you watch the Warwick students perform the Agamemnon are bright lights, coloured fabrics, and cut flowers, and wind chimes that ghost the unseen presence of the Furies. If you came last year, you'd have seen a ton of earth upon the stage, beaten by the desperate, defeated hands of Queen Atossa, soaking up the hopeful, hopeless libations of the chorus of old Persian men. Next year, that soil, the whole ton of it, will return to this stage to soak up the liquid that will pour this time from the libation bearer's hands. So across the whole sequence of plays, the Persians last year, Agamemnon this year, and the two plays that are its sequel and will be performed together next year, the same themes recur, generating the engine that brings the half-seen, lurking presence of the Furies out into the open, and in the final play, into the real, visible, tangible space of Athens, a world that for us must be visualized, reimagined when we study the plays and the pots that survive, but a world that for the first audience, as it sat in the theatre of Dionysus, on the slopes of the Acropolis in the heart of Athens, was their world, a world in which unseen forces really did surround and fill them, shaping their lives. Now, I know that Emanuela will talk more about this in her lecture, and will do so in her lectures next year as well. So in this lecture, I want to do something a little different. I want to take you on a whistle-stop journey through some images of the Oresteia myth on a selection of painted pots. And I want to think with you about how material culture, in its own distinctive way, prompts viewers to imagine the Furies, to notice their presence in hints and visual refrains, just as you will, I hope, do when you watch the performance today. I'll leave some time at the end for questions, because I'd love to hear your ideas and responses to the images you're about to see. And I know that it might feel a bit daunting to speak up in this enormous space. So if you need to, please do feel free to write your questions down as we go. I'd love to hear them. So I'll begin with an example from 5th century BCE Attica, and Attica is the area around Athens, a pot that we can think of as broadly contemporaneous with the Agamemnon. I'll then show you a 4th century BCE South Italian pot. And lastly, I want to return to a Greek example, but this time from the 7th century BCE, so 2 centuries before the performance of the Agamemnon. And this final pot might offer us a glimpse of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, the shadow of which is felt from the first entrance of the chorus in the Agamemnon. I want to end with this pot. You can see it on the right here because it's my favourite. But this does mean we'll effectively be working backwards plot-wise, beginning with the Eumenides, proceeding to the libation bearers, and concluding with the Agamemnon. Okay, so we begin with a red figure Attic mixing bowl of around 450 to 440 BCE held in the British Museum. So you can actually go and see this weekend if you want. One side of the pot shows Orestes taking refuge at the sanctuary of Apollo as a Fury approaches from the right. You can see her in the larger image there on the right. In between them stands Apollo, and in this sense, the scene painted here corresponds with the opening scenes of the third play, Aeschylus's Eumenides. Orestes is shown holding a sword in his right hand and spears in his left. His right foot, leg bent at the knee, is set upon a stony pile that might be the omphalos, the sacred stone that was located in the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. Blood trickles down his torso into the stony ground beneath him. His left leg is outstretched in a manner that suggests he's come to a stop upon the altar after swift motion from the right, presumably as he ran away from the winged figure. And this winged figure is, as I said, the Fury, and she's dressed to run like the wind, so note the short tunic that she's wearing. Her two wings spread behind her, and her right arm outstretched towards Orestes. Two snakes emerge from her forehead like horns and strain, like her arm, towards the fleeing figure. In the center is the god Apollo, complete with rippling locks and a laurel wreath, right arm raised above his head, left hand grasping a forked branch. So at first glance, the most striking feature of the Fury here is her visibility. Like the chorus in Aeschylus's Eumenides, she bursts abruptly into the picture. The faces of Apollo and Orestes, turned in profile to the right, direct our eyes upon her face and body. And in this respect, the image emphasizes her unmistakable presence and her visual impact. But let's look more closely. Consider first the face of Orestes, which is tilted ever so slightly towards the ground. Yes, Apollo's line of sight falls directly upon the Fury's face, his own two-pronged branch approaching the two-pronged snakes at her forehead. But Apollo is a god with, like Cassandra, extraordinary clarity of sight. By contrast, it's unclear whether Orestes actually sees this Fury, a possibility that's heightened by the presence of not just Apollo, whose body physically, protectively divides the visual field into two separate spaces, but the repeated lines of the spears and the branch, which demarcate spaces inhabited by each figure and sever the mortal sphere of Orestes from that of the Fury. Now look closely at the figure's feet. Orestes' left foot is closest in proximity to the viewer. Behind his is Apollo's, and set at still greater distance from you, the real beholder, is the right foot of the Fury. Her arm, meanwhile, reaches in front of the god, rendering her part behind, part in front, a hint perhaps of half-presence. There's another suggestion of half-presence, part visibility at the borders of the image. So notice how the Fury's wings and her left foot break into the dotted border behind her, but are still cut through by a single line that marks the transition point between the space inhabited by the figures and the decorative border around it. She is, it seems, neither completely in front of this border nor behind it. She's half substantial body, half translucent image. Let's turn the pot around. What do we see on the other side? The British Museum describes this scene as a procession of revelers. But to me, what's most striking here, by comparison with the scene on the other side, is the impression of calm surface. Each of these figures is copiously wrapped up, and each has a voting staff. These look like Athenian citizens, and at least two of them seem to be at rest. They're not at least running. But the pose of the male figure in the center, so his feet moving towards the left, his head looking back to the right with a staff instead of a branch in his left hand, is reminiscent of Apollo on the other side of the pot, while his right arm outstretched recalls the Fury. So in this sense, the size of the pot are linked. And if you imagine this mixing bowl in use at a Greek symposium, so at a male drinking party, set centrally within a room designed such that drinkers recline on couches around the edge of the room, you might imagine how an ancient viewer, initially confronted with, as it were, a classically Athenian contemporary scene of comparative calm, might come to see the invisible presence of the Fury that lurks around the corner, perhaps because they physically move around the room in the drinking party, perhaps if the pot were just to be turned around. In that sort of dynamic, dare I say, performative space at this symposium, the space in which a Fury bursts into the world lies beneath or behind the other. She's always there and might at any moment come into view, or partially into view, on a turn of the pot. So there's a similar relationship on an Athenian red figure bowl of a similar date in the Musée du Louvre in Paris. On this one, a more tranquil, orderly scene in which Athenian citizens appear to be conversing with a male figure transforms, on a turn of the pot, into another scene of Orestes claiming sanctuary on the stone in the sanctuary of Apollo. And here too, a Fury enters from the right, and again she's half in, half out, breaking the frame of the picture with her wings and body, as Athena does with the tip of her spear. So this breaching of the boundaries of their environment might suggest these deities are not like mortals. They exist beyond as well as within the visible space inhabited by mortals. So let's move on to the second pot. This one is a red figure storage jar, an amphora from South Italy. It's been dated to around 335 to 320 BCE, so a bit over 100 years later than the other one. And it's held in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. It's monumental in size, standing approximately half a metre tall, and it's richly decorated with added white and other colours such as yellow on the snakes. The scene on one side of the pot shows two nude male figures in cloaks and boots, carrying spears and travellers' hats, and standing beside a tall white column set upon a stone base. To the right of the column is a female figure wearing a black dress with an embroidered shawl and carrying a large water jar and a long piece of fabric. This is Electra at the tomb of her father Agamemnon, together with her brother Orestes and his close friend Pylades. In this sense, the scene painted here corresponds with the opening scenes of the second play, Aeschylus's Libation Bearers. In the two corners at the top of the scene are two female heads turned in profile towards one another. Snakes entwine their hair, and the winged female figure in the top right stretches her arms above the scene towards the center of the image, towards the top of Agamemnon's memorial, brandishing a snake on the cusp, perhaps, of dropping it into the picture. Now, in Aeschylus's version of the Oresteia, the Furies do not physically appear in the performance space until the third play. And in his Libation Bearers, Orestes does not claim to see them until the final scene. But as Emanuela has shown, they have been there from the beginning, suggestively conjured by language of, amongst other things, fire, colour, wind, and earth. And I think we can detect a similar emphasis on partial visibility in the scene here. The three mortal figures do not, it seems, see the Furies. Rather, the lines of sight from the figures seem to emphasize intimacy between the two male figures, and possibly Electra's recognition of her brother, or else her recollection of him while standing at her father's tomb. Notice too how the Furies are in the scene and outside it. They're present but half seen, glimpsed on the fringes, divided from the scene below by a series of yellow dots, lines that demarcate space and look visibly porous. Encircling the body of the pot, above the scene and below, is a continuous wave pattern. As ornamental motifs go, this is not in itself unusual, but here it does contribute to a theme of liquidity, the fluid that Electra will pour onto the grave, into the earth from her jar, or that she might shed from her eyes, as she does in Aeschylus's play. Meanwhile, the colours here, including black, white, yellow, and red, are evocative of the same warm, vibrant colours that we also find in the plays. These are the orange hues of saffron dye, of yellow bile, the colour of bitterness and anger, of crushed purple fish, and of blood. But most significant, I think, is the image of a siren, half woman, half bird, on the neck of the pot. So look right at the top of the pot, above the scene of Orestes. This beautiful monster is set up in parallel to Electra below. Like Electra, whose lower half is wrapped in embroidered fabric, her lower half, the siren's lower half, is covered in speckles. Like Electra, she brings funerary gifts, in her case, a basket filled with offerings and a strip of fabric known as a taenia. These strips were used to decorate the grave. She stands beside an altar, which is crowned like Agamemnon's grave, with round objects, perhaps eggs, and she holds before her face a yellow mirror, a detail that draws attention not just to her beauty, or at least her visual appearance, but the possibility that we really are here meant to see reflections and doubles on this pot. In this case, the siren as Electra's reflection, or vice versa. So what I find fascinating about this is that sirens are themselves in a conceptual relationship with the Furies. As Emanuela explains in her book, both these monstrous female figures are associated with air, breath, and wind, and with the power of song. So are we to glimpse through this siren the half-seen presence of the Furies? And if so, might we transfer those to the girl Electra below, seemingly calm and composed, but perhaps beneath the surface, seething with a rage and bitterness that longs to erupt? Turn the pot around, so we're now looking at the pot on the right-hand side, and we encounter a reconfiguration of the scene. Here is an interchange between two figures, one male, one female, each with strips of fabric. The woman, like the siren on the other side of the pot, holds a mirror. And to a viewer that's already seen the other side, this might be the reunion between Orestes and Electra, though the figures do look different. But it might also now be a contemporary scene. It is, in this respect, open-ended. It slips between the possibility it might tell a specific mythological story and the possibility it might belong to the world of its beholders, to the real world, whoever they are. What's also important here is the mood. The scene appears intimate and joyful, and the two faces above the scene, framing it on either side at the top, are noticeably not wreathed in snakes. So the museum comments, the contrast with the snake-haired Furies on the other side of the pot is hard to miss, but these more benign observers can hardly be the Eumenides. So while I agree the contrast is palpable, it seems to me that these benign observers just might be the Eumenides, now in their aspect as the kindly ones, the aspect they'll also adopt at the conclusion of the Oresteia trilogy. Not because I think the pot's trying to illustrate Aeschylus's plays, but because the pot does seem to be interested in visibility and in the power that lurks around and beneath the surface. And the Furies, benevolent or otherwise, remain there, seen or unseen, in the background, whether we're in the Argos of mythology or in classical Athens. And in this sense, the liberally wrapped up figure on the neck, so on the neck on the other side from the siren, is a very picture of what can't be seen because he's so swathed in fabric, and it suddenly seems more significant. But this pot isn't from Athens, it's from 4th century Italy. And this is significant because it's not just a portal onto Greek culture. It's come from a context that was specifically a funerary one. This pot, monumental in size and ornate in style, seems to have been made for the grave, or perhaps also for a funeral. And in this different context, this South Italian context, a world that's in some ways so distant from the world of a drama festival, a scene of a visit to the grave might have carried a more intimate and personal resonance to the mourners who might have looked at it. And when it comes to the Furies, we might imagine how their association with presence, and conceivably benevolent presence, on the fringes, even when no longer tangible or visible, might be comforting, a source of solace rather than dread. So before we move on to the third example, I want to show you briefly some comparable ones from South Italy, which each engage with the visibility of the Furies in their own way. So the motif of the head or bust seen on the edges of the scene, often with snakes, is a popular one. It's also seen on this storage jar in the Getty Museum and on this mixing bowl in the British Museum. And both these examples are of a similar date and are from South Italy. On others, the Furies are shown asleep, as on this mixing bowl in Boston, or half asleep, half awake, as on this bowl in the Louvre, where the ones that are asleep are shown in full body, while the one that's woken up is only half in the picture. And on one example, held in St. Petersburg, the Furies have been painted in black matte on black gloss, capturing, in a play of black on black, their half-seen nature. So we end with an example that's like the Furies, partially visible. So the image on the scene is a photograph of a fragment of a mixing bowl that's dated to roughly 650 to 630 BCE. And this photograph was printed in a 1971 publication. It's actually a screenshot of the image in that publication, at which time the fragment was on anonymous loan to the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Since then, the fragment's been returned to its owner, and its location is not publicly available. The lost pot's fragmentary state only makes things more tantalizing. Even if we could track down the physical fragment, the colours of which are lost in this black and white photo, we would not see the whole pot. And even if we could see the whole pot, we'd still, as 21st century viewers interested in ancient Greece, specifically interested in Aeschylus's Agamemnon, encounter all the challenges of trying to piece together a lost world of meaning and significance, of which this pot is an enigmatic clue. So to me then, this hidden fragment of a pot from a lost world, reimagined through a lost black and white photograph, is exemplary of our relationship with the ancient world. We have here the tantalizing possibility and challenge of connecting with the past through the prism of its remains. So in the top left, male figures are carrying a female figure horizontal in their arms. You can only see her foot. From the position of her foot, it seems likely that her body faced upwards. The rest of the scene seethes with vitality. Black whirling tendrils around the clay body, symmetrical bunches at the handles, and an assortment of vegetal motifs in the pictorial field. Below is an encounter between two monstrous sea creatures, members of a larger shoal that would have circled the whole pot. And on the other side, seen in the top right here, is a bearded figure. Now, the scene's been interpreted tentatively as a depiction of virgin sacrifice, possibly the sacrifice of Iphigenia. And if that's true, this would make this pot our earliest example of immaterial art of a subject that's extremely rare in the early visual arts, virgin sacrifice, but a relatively popular theme in 5th century tragedy, of which Aeschylus's Agamemnon, with its opening description by the chorus of the sacrifice of Iphigenia, is just one example. Now, there's a lot that we cannot see here. For one thing, we can't really see the girl herself, let alone what's happening to her. We also can't see any Furies, but what we can see is evocative of much more than the literal. Consider the gaping mouths of the sea monsters below, evoking a scream that can only be imagined. Aeschylus' Iphigenia too is denied her voice in the moment of sacrifice and can only send shafts of remonstration from her eyes. The imagery is also sensorially rich, so note the detail of the girl's embroidered dress and compare the saffron-dyed dress that 2 centuries later, Aeschylus' Iphigenia will pour like liquid to the ground. In the production, you'll see that dress featuring as a constant reminder of Iphigenia's sacrifice, embroidered with bloody stains. In the text, Aeschylus' Iphigenia drips a deep yellow, orange, red. And if we had a colour photograph of this fragment, we might see the browns and reds that the publishers of the pot reported in 1971. In addition to visible colour, we have an abundance of flowers and plants. As in the play, we're encouraged to see an explosion of colour and vitality that's evocative not just of life, but of life that is quenched, life that is plucked like a flower and withers away, or that's squeezed into the colours of bitterness and death. In a world where Furies are half seen in red, orange, and yellow, might we glimpse them even here in this half-seen fragment? So in this lecture, I've looked closely at 3 painted pots from the ancient world, and I've explored some ways in which they might have prompted viewers to imagine the Furies, to notice their presence in hints and refrains, just as you will, I hope, do when you watch the performance today.